He saved lives for decades as a firefighter, risking everything for people he didn't even know. Then, one afternoon, he was humiliated in a café while everyone looked away. But when the footage went viral, justice took an unexpected turn, and the punishment struck deeper than anyone imagined. What happened next revealed more than guilt. It revealed transformation. Summer of 2022. The town of Bozeman, Montana, stirred to life under a soft morning sun. The streets carried the scent of freshly baked bread wafting from the old corner bakery, blending with the faint aroma of pine and asphalt warmed by early light. Joggers passed with rhythmic strides, earbuds in, breath visible in the cool air. Pickup trucks rolled slowly down Main Street, tires crunching against loose gravel, their drivers nodding to neighbors they'd seen 1,000 times before. Walter Calloway, 79 years old, stepped out of his modest single-story house on Cedar Avenue. His gait was slow but deliberate, supported by a polished wooden cane that had traveled with him for nearly a decade. He buttoned his pale blue shirt with care, making sure each cuff was even and his collar neatly turned. A beige cap covered his thinning gray hair, and his eyes, still sharp despite age, scanned the quiet street with familiarity. Walter had served almost 4 decades as a firefighter in Bozeman. His name had once been known in every fire station across the county. His hands, though now stiff from arthritis, had once gripped hoses in freezing winds and carried children from burning homes. Retirement had not come easy, but he had made peace with it. Routine became his anchor. Every Saturday morning, without fail, he walked to the town's public library, a red brick building with ivy crawling along its northern wall. His route took him past a small park where children were already chasing a soccer ball across the damp grass. Older couples strolled hand in hand, their dogs tugging gently at leashes. A group of teenagers clustered near a food truck, laughing over breakfast burritos and iced coffees. Walter nodded to a few familiar faces. Some greeted him back with casual recognition, others with a vague glance, unsure if they knew him. He didn't mind. He wasn't looking for attention. When he arrived at the library, the doors were already unlocked. Inside, the quiet offered a kind of comfort no city noise could replace. He hung his cap on the stand near the door and set to work. Shelves needed straightening, books needed sorting. Occasionally, a child would approach, pointing to a cover or asking what a word meant. Walter always made time to help, offering suggestions, telling small stories tied to the titles. The librarians appreciated his presence. To them, he wasn't just an old man with time to spare. He was a part of the place. As the hours passed, the morning sun climbed higher, casting dappled light across the reading tables. Walter worked steadily, his movements slow but precise. There was a quiet joy in the repetition, a sense of usefulness that filled the spaces where excitement had once lived. By noon, his work was done. He packed a few personal notes into his worn leather folder, nodded to the front desk staff, and made his way back outside, cane tapping softly against the concrete with each step. On his way back home, Walter decided to stop by a new café that had opened just a few blocks from the library. The place was bright and trendy, with neon signs in the windows and minimalist decor that clearly catered to a younger crowd. Inside, the space was filled with the clatter of coffee machines, the hum of conversation, and the sharp scent of roasted espresso beans mixed with something sweet and artificial. Music played low in the background, an upbeat rhythm that seemed to make the walls pulse. Walter moved slowly toward the counter, leaning slightly on his cane. He stood quietly near the far end, waiting patiently behind a small cluster of customers. His posture was slightly hunched, his hand gripping the edge of the counter for balance. No one paid him much attention. Behind him, a group of 3 teenage boys had gathered, laughing loudly, showing each other something on their phones. They spoke in fast bursts, joking about music, cars, and videos. Wisps of vapor curled from the electronic cigarettes they passed between them. One of the boys, shifting suddenly without looking, stepped back hard. His shoulder struck Walter, jolting him sideways. The old man staggered, nearly falling, but caught himself against the counter. He didn't say anything, just held himself steady, blinking through his glasses. The boy didn't notice or didn't care. Laughter erupted from the group, louder this time. One of them turned, glanced at Walter, then deliberately pushed him again, harder. The impact was too much. Walter lost his balance completely. His cane slipped from his hand and skidded across the tile floor. His glasses flew from his face as he fell sideways, his body hitting the ground with a dull, heavy thud. A few people glanced over, but no one moved. The barista behind the counter turned away, busying himself with a new drink order. The other patrons returned to their phones and conversations, as if nothing had happened. The boys, still laughing, walked casually toward the door and exited, their laughter echoing behind them. Walter remained on the floor for a few moments, propped on one elbow, catching his breath. His hand searched the ground until he found his glasses, which now sat crooked on his nose. Slowly, carefully, he reached for his cane, retrieved it, and pulled himself upright with effort. His legs trembled slightly beneath him. Without looking at anyone, he stepped up to the counter, handed the cashier a few bills, and collected the sandwich and lemonade he had come for. Outside, the air felt heavier. Walter made his way to a bench just outside the café and sat down slowly, resting his cane across his knees. He took a few deep breaths, his chest rising and falling beneath the soft folds of his shirt. His eyes stared forward, unfocused, not angry, not afraid, just tired. The kind of tired that settled deep where no rest could reach. The sandwich remained untouched in the paper bag on his lap. Traffic passed by without pause. The world moved on. The following morning, the story began to ripple quietly through Bozeman's online community. A young woman who had been seated near the back of the cafe had filmed part of the incident on her phone. The footage wasn't long, just a shaky 30-second clip, but it captured the push, the fall, the laughter, and most painfully, the silence that followed. She posted it to a local Facebook group with a simple caption, "Is this how we treat the people who once saved lives?" Within hours, the post had been shared hundreds of times. By afternoon, it had reached tens of thousands. News outlets from around the state picked it up, embedding the video in online articles with headlines that questioned the state of community values. Comment sections filled with outrage, sympathy, and disbelief. Some recognized Walter immediately. Others searched for his name, unearthed old stories and public records, and soon found an archived newspaper interview from over a decade earlier. In it, Walter described pulling 2 children from a house fire, working 36 straight hours during a wildfire crisis, and leading a rescue effort in a collapsed apartment building. The clip and accompanying posts went viral. Not in a sensational way, but with a slow, building wave of collective reflection and shame. He was no longer just an old man on a bench. He was a retired hero whose quiet suffering had been captured and exposed to the world. Local journalists began showing up at his home. Some knocked politely, others left notes in the mailbox or business cards on the porch railing. Walter didn't answer. He had no interest in becoming a symbol or a victim. He wasn't angry, just unwilling to be turned into a headline. News of the incident reached his daughter, Sarah Calloway, a police officer stationed in a neighboring county. She saw the video late that night, sitting in her kitchen in uniform, and dropped her phone mid-playback. The next morning, she took personal leave and drove straight to Bozeman. When she arrived at her father's house, he met her on the porch, calm but firm. He asked her not to intervene officially. He didn't want his name attached to an arrest or to fuel more attention. He simply wanted the town to move on. But the town wasn't ready to move on. The story had taken on a life of its own. Public pressure mounted. Civic leaders and city officials issued statements condemning the behavior and promising accountability. The mayor's office released a formal acknowledgement of Walter's service record and an apology for the community's silence. The police department launched an internal review of the incident, not because of a formal complaint, but because residents demanded it. The cafe's management issued a public apology on social media and promised to cooperate fully with the investigation. With video evidence circulating widely, identifying the teenagers had not taken long. Surveillance footage from inside the cafe provided clear images. Local high school staff and parents recognized the boys almost immediately. Names were confirmed and reports filed. Quiet meetings began between law enforcement, school officials, and the teens' families. What had started as a single act of cruelty had now ignited a broader conversation about respect, generational disconnect, and the quiet ways society fails the very people it once relied on. A few days after the video reached its peak, the heart of Bozeman transformed. On a quiet Thursday morning, the central square, usually occupied by casual shoppers and dog walkers, filled with a crowd holding handmade signs and banners. The air buzzed with voices, the soft flapping of poster board in the breeze, and the distant hum of local media equipment being set up along the curb. The rally had started as a small online idea, a shared post among friends, but it grew rapidly as more people felt the weight of what had happened to Walter and what it represented. Teachers from nearby schools showed up, many bringing their students with them. Parents stood beside their children, some holding their hands tightly as they explained why they were there. Former firefighters who had once worked with Walter arrived in full uniform, their presence quiet but powerful. College students held up signs scrawled with phrases like, "Respect our elders," "Honor before apathy," and "Old doesn't mean invisible." Elderly residents stood on the fringes of the gathering, watching with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. For many, it was the first time they felt seen in years. The demonstration remained peaceful. People took turns stepping onto a makeshift platform near the fountain, sharing stories, reading aloud from printed articles, and quoting lines from the viral video that had stirred the community. One woman recounted how Walter had once helped her mother evacuate a building during a kitchen fire. Another spoke about her own father, a retired truck driver, and how he, too, had started feeling forgotten. The square became more than a protest. It became a moment of reckoning. Conversations broke out among strangers about how the elderly were treated, why kindness had become conditional, and what needed to change. At the same time, Sarah Calloway was working quietly behind the scenes. While her father avoided the public attention, she coordinated with city officials to plan a formal recognition. She contacted the town council, worked with the local veterans group, and arranged for a small ceremony to be held in the council chamber. She didn't tell Walter until the last moment, convincing him only after promising it would be brief and private. The ceremony, however, drew more people than expected. The chamber filled quickly with residents, officials, and local press. Walter stood near the front in a clean collared shirt and neatly pressed pants, leaning slightly on his cane. The mayor spoke first, followed by a councilwoman who read from Walter's service history. As the final words were spoken, a certificate of commendation was presented to him. Walter took it slowly, his hands slightly trembling. For the first time in many years, he smiled, not out of obligation, but with genuine warmth. After the applause settled and the room began to empty, a small boy walked hesitantly up to Walter. He wore a red jacket and held a folded piece of paper in both hands. Without saying anything, he placed it in Walter's hand and stepped back. The note was simple, written in large, uneven letters. It said, "Thank you for saving people. I want to be like you." Walter read it once, then again. The message struck him more deeply than any speech or certificate. He tucked the note carefully into his shirt pocket, nodding slowly as the boy returned to his parents. Later, as they left the building and walked down the front steps, Walter paused for a moment. He looked out at the quiet town that had changed so suddenly, not in appearance, but in awareness. For the first time in a long time, he no longer felt like a relic of the past. He felt part of the present. Cody Brooks, one of the teenagers involved in the incident at the café, was sentenced by the local juvenile court to a term of community service instead of juvenile detention. The judge, influenced by the tone of the public discourse and Walter's quiet refusal to press charges, chose a path of restoration rather than punishment. Cody was assigned to complete his hours at the Bozeman Veterans Home, a modest facility on the outskirts of town that housed retired servicemen and women, including several former firefighters and rescue workers. As part of his service, he was also required to attend a series of supervised meetings with Walter Calloway. Their first meeting was brief and quiet. Walter, seated in a wooden chair in the home's sunlit common room, looked out the window while Cody sat across from him, his hands in his lap, his posture tense. Neither spoke. The air between them held the weight of what had happened and the uncertainty of what might come. Cody left that day without saying much, his expression unreadable. The following week, he returned. The second meeting took place in the same room, but something shifted. Walter spoke, not with anger, not with accusation, but with memory. He recounted one of his earliest calls as a firefighter, describing the smoke, the heat, the confusion. He spoke of a boy not much older than Cody who had been trapped in an upstairs bedroom. Cody listened, his gaze fixed on the floor at first, but slowly rising as Walter continued. As the story went on, Walter mentioned the colleague he had lost in that fire, a man who had entered the building a second time to save a child and never came back out. Cody didn't interrupt. He asked no questions, but he returned again and again. With each visit, he listened more. In time, he began assisting the staff with small tasks, folding laundry, serving meals, pushing wheelchairs through the garden. He wasn't required to do more than observe and participate in his scheduled meetings, but something compelled him to stay longer each day. The veterans, initially skeptical, began acknowledging him with nods and short greetings. One of them handed him a folded flag and explained its meaning. Another showed him a photograph taken during the Korean War. Cody kept listening. When his mandatory service hours ended, he continued coming. What began as obligation turned into choice. He found comfort in the routines of the home, in the quiet dignity of the residents, in the stories that connected one generation to another. For the first time in his young life, he felt needed, not for his strength or defiance, but for his willingness to show up and be present. Walter watched the transformation with steady eyes. He never offered praise, but neither did he hold back approval when it was earned. In Cody's actions, he saw a reflection of the values he had spent a lifetime living by: resilience, responsibility, humility. He never sought revenge for what had happened. What he gave instead was a mirror, a path, and a chance. The Bozeman Public Library, hearing of Cody's continued volunteer work, partnered with the Veterans Home to organize a community program. They invited local students to join a series of listening sessions where veterans shared their experiences and answered questions. Cody was asked to help facilitate. At first, the students arrived out of curiosity or extra credit, but as they listened to the stories, tales of courage, fear, loss, and duty, something changed. Their attention sharpened. They asked questions. They took notes. In that room filled with mismatched chairs and plastic pitchers of water, a bridge formed between past and present. Cody stood at the center, no longer the kid from the video, but a quiet thread in a growing tapestry of understanding. Walter, seated in the back, watched it unfold, knowing that sometimes the greatest victories came not from shouting, but from being willing to listen and let others find their own way. A year had passed. The seasons turned quietly in Bozeman, each one softening the edges of time. Walter still lived in his modest house on Cedar Avenue. The neighborhood hadn't changed much, but something in the air felt different, gentler, more aware. Every Saturday morning, as he had for years, Walter made his way to the public library, the same cane in hand, the same slow and steady pace. But now, he wasn't walking toward silence. He was walking toward a room that waited for him. Inside the library, a group of teenagers gathered in a circle of chairs, notebooks in laps, phones put away. They came not because they had to, but because they wanted to hear from him. Walter didn't speak like a lecturer. He spoke like someone sharing moments. He told them about the firehouse on 7th Street, the winter storms that froze hydrants solid, the calls that came in at 2 a.m. when everything else in the world was asleep. But he also spoke about kindness, about showing up when it's inconvenient, about listening when it's easier to ignore. Among those teens sat Cody Brooks, now a familiar presence in the community. He had grown in small but visible ways. His voice was steadier, his shoulders more relaxed. The project he had started, Helping Hands, had begun with a handful of volunteers visiting seniors on weekends. They ran errands, fixed broken steps, taught them how to use smartphones. Within months, it had grown. The city council approved funding, local businesses chipped in supplies, newspapers covered the story, and other towns in Montana began reaching out to replicate the model. Walter watched it all unfold, not with pride, but with a kind of quiet fulfillment. On clear mornings, he would sit by the tall windows in the library with a cup of coffee in hand, observing the teenagers as they organized sign-up sheets and schedules. He watched them laugh, argue, plan. They moved with energy, unaware of how different they had become from who they were a year ago. He no longer wore a uniform. He no longer climbed ladders or carried people from danger. His body couldn't do those things anymore. But in a quieter, slower way, he was still saving lives, not with speed, but with presence, not through action, but through example. He gave the town something it had almost forgotten how to hold: perspective, memory, gratitude. There were no grand celebrations, no sirens, no banners, no medals pinned to his chest. But respect had returned, not in speeches, but in gestures, in teenagers showing up on a Sunday to fix a fence, in a boy helping an old woman carry groceries across a slushy parking lot, in the way people looked at Walter now, not past him, but at him. He never asked for applause. He never wanted recognition. But in that simple act of showing up, week after week, he had reignited something far more powerful than any ceremony. A town had learned to look again, to notice, to value. In a world of noise, Walter's legacy was not loud. It was steady, like his walk to the library, like the way a hand reaches out, not for thanks, but to help. And for him, that was more than enough.